Well, you know, Lee, the only book that sold more copies in the 1800s was the Bible. In the very first year of Uncle Tom's Cabin, she sold 300,000 copies in the United States and well over a million within 10 years. From 1852 up till the start of the Civil War, she sold 1.5 million copies just in England, Great Britain alone, the very first year, much more popular than it was even here in the United States. She galvanized the world against the idea of slavery. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Rare Book Cafe. This is probably going to be a coffee break cut. By the time you finish a cup of coffee, you will have visited the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. Here I am in Hartford, Connecticut, just a stone's throw away from the Mark Twain home, and this is the home of Harriet Beecher Stowe. As you could read on this National Historic Ledger, Harriet Beecher Stowe House, National Historic Landmark. This site possesses national significance in commemorating the history of America. Prolific author Harriet Beecher Stowe achieved fame as an abolitionist with her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. She lived here for more than 2 decades, advocating for social justice, equality, and family issues. Well, they won't let me take videos inside, but I did take a few photographs, and through the magic of technology, Alan is going to hook myself and Lee up, and we're going to have a little conversation about Harriet Beecher Stowe. Lee, this is without a doubt perhaps the most important book of the whole 19th century. When Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, allegedly he said to her, "So, you're the little woman that wrote that book that started this great war." Lee, what are your comments about Harriet Beecher Stowe, and how important is it to read that book even today?
Well, Ed, whether or not Lincoln actually said that, the book was instrumental in firing up sympathy, anti-slavery sympathy in the North and pro-slavery sympathy in the South. It produced an enormous number of books in favor of slavery. Authors like William Gilmore Simms were very instrumental in that regard. But it was responsible for a lot of abolitionist activity in the North. Harriet Beecher Stowe came from a line of preachers and scholars. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was a minister, and one thing that I have are a couple of his sermons. It seems that in the Boston area, sermons were printed for public distribution pretty much the day after they were given, and so that people who were not attending those churches could find the sermons for the church they didn't go to, or perhaps the church that they would like to have gone to hear Lyman Beecher preach. One of these is from 1828, and one is from 1832. She was one of, oh gracious, 9 children, maybe more than that. There were a lot of Beecher kids. One of her brothers, probably the best known of her siblings, was Henry Ward Beecher. And he also was a famous preacher and scholar. And this is an article from, I'm going to take this out. This is an article from the Brooklyn Monthly magazine. And it is, it's about Henry Ward Beecher. And according to the writer of this article, Beecher was about the most important person after Jesus. He goes on for page after page about what a wonderful person Mr. Beecher or Dr. Beecher or whatever he was is. It's really interesting. And in it is an ad for the publisher who prints Henry Ward Beecher's sermons and other writings, so that you too can have your very own copies of those. So those are interesting, and it seems to have been a phenomenon that I have only seen in Boston of having sermons printed so frequently. But at any rate, that's the background that she comes from. The style of the book is very sentimental. It seems very dated to readers today. But Stowe involved the reader in the fight against slavery by developing her characters and by giving the notion that individuals' actions could be important in the battle against slavery. And while we don't have slave cabins today, prejudices not just against blacks, but against other marginalized groups and immigrant groups are still pronounced. And the message of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a very sentimental, love your neighbor, religious message, is still worth rereading. Though it is interesting to note that Stowe herself, as much as she was opposed to the horrors of slavery, did not really see blacks as equals and was very much in favor of repatriating them to African colonies, but was certainly vehemently opposed to slavery.
Well, you know, Lee, the only book that sold more copies in the 1800s was the Bible. In the very first year of Uncle Tom's Cabin, she sold 300,000 copies in the United States and well over 1 million within 10 years. From 1852 up till the start of the Civil War. She sold 1.5 million copies just in England, Great Britain alone, the very first year, much more popular than it was even here in the United States. She galvanized the world against the idea of slavery. In the first 2 years, the book was translated into 22 languages, and it was the very first American book translated into Chinese. Lee, can you think of any other book, perhaps in the maybe 20th century, that was just as monumental, just as elemental to the history of our nation as this?
That's a very hard question, Ed, and I think that there are a number of possibilities that stand out. I did look at some listings of the most important books of the 20th century to kind of get some ideas, and I think that there are many that we might consider as being pivotal in one area or another. One that comes to mind is 1984, with its dystopian view of an autocratic government. To Kill a Mockingbird, dealing with social justice and racial equality, or at least racial prejudice. Silent Spring, on environmental issues. Harlem Renaissance writers, any number of them, on racism. Books on the Great Depression, like A.G.'s Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Books about the Depression, and another environmental issue, The Great Dust Bowl in The Grapes of Wrath. Our Bodies, Ourselves, on women's rights. I remember reading that in the early 70s when I was a young married woman myself. One thing I think is evident that we have not paid enough attention to the message of some of these and other books as well, and are books that we should go back and reread.
In the end, we are measured by what we say and by what we do, which is even much more important than what we believe. Yeah, it's okay to be anti-slavery, but of course it's okay today, but even back in the 1850s, it was okay to be anti-slavery. But to move from being an anti-slavery advocate to be an abolitionist required words and deeds and actions. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, they all took it upon themselves to do something, to make something, to be something, to protest the situation in America. And I'd like to leave our guests with that same offer, that same implorement, that same encouragement. What are you going to do about something that's unjust? That's unfair. That's not good for our society. Lee, what do you think? How should we encourage our listeners and other readers about making an impact today?
You're absolutely right. And we tend to watch the news and wring our hands, but we're reluctant to speak out. We seem to have lost the ability to disagree in a civil manner. Um, you have to start small. Be good to those around you. Treat those around you equally. Participate in activities that help other people. Vote for people who support the Constitution and equal rights for everyone. I think these are all things that we should and can do. The last few words on Uncle Tom's Cabin. Over the years, I've probably had 6 or 7 different editions, and right now I have 3 that, let's see. This is a really pretty Easton Press Uncle Tom's Cabin, bound in leather with moire end papers and illustrations by Miguel, his name I can never pronounce, Covarrubias, who was a famous Harlem Renaissance era illustrator, graphic designer, artist, also known for illustrations in Locke's The New Negro, which he did some of the illustrations for. So it's a very pretty book, and just a nice copy of an important book. More on the line of popular books, this is a little issue published by Books Incorporated. It's called, let me find it and then I'll hold it up, The World's Popular Classics. And it doesn't have a date in it, so I'm not real sure of the date on that. But this is obviously a book that could have been easily obtained and probably fairly cheaply obtained. And then this is from 1879, and it is an illustrated Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the illustrator is not listed. But the interesting thing about this is that there is a bibliography in it of editions of Uncle Tom's Cabin up until 1879. And it's page after page after page of different editions, of different translations. And that in itself is a good reason to have this book. The illustrations are black and white, probably woodcuts. You can see those, and are on pretty much every other page. It's nicely bound, very attractive volume. I've had a first British edition, sometime in the past. And I think the most interesting one that I have had is not a book at all, but a cardboard playset of buildings on Simon Legree's plantation. There are no people. I don't know whether it came with little people or not. These were just the buildings, but that was certainly an interesting offshoot of the Uncle Tom's Cabin universe, I suppose you would say. Ed was able to take a number of pictures inside the home, and we're going to show those photographs, and I'm going to tell you what Ed had to say about them. Here on the wall to the entryway of the home are quotes from famous people, including Harriet Beecher Stowe herself. She had lost a child, and then almost 20 years later, she saw a mother separated from her child at a slave auction. And she said, as a mother, a human, and a Christian, it was her duty to say something about slavery and what it did to people. 85% of the contents of the house were there at the time she was in the home for more than 20 years. On the wall is a picture of her father, who was a stern pastor and orator of the era. He passed that gift of public speaking on to one of his sons, Henry Ward Beecher, who was also an ardent abolitionist and public speaker in the second half of the 19th century. Here in the living room, you see chairs assembled in a circle, as they were in the day of her occupation of the home. Many evening nights were filled with authors and luminaries who came to discuss social issues of the era. After the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Stowe found it necessary to write a book-length footnote, including the bibliography, interviews, stories of people who experienced slavery, to provide validation and justification for the book. Too many people, especially in the South, criticized the book for not being truthful or accurate, and she was forced to defend the veracity of the novel she had written. I also read that she had to go back and do some research to back up what she had already written about. She often wrote at a little table in her bedroom, which was not very organized and a bit messy, but she made every effort to reply to letters she received. She was also a painter, and some of the paintings you see on the wall behind the table are hers. Uncle Tom's Cabin quickly became the most published book in the 19th century after the Bible. In the first couple of years, it was published in 22 languages and was the first American book published in Chinese, the first edition with copies of other books from around the world. And a painting of Stowe hangs in the hallway on the way out the front door. You can see in her burning eyes that there's no hesitation about what she wrote. No regret for the maelstrom of controversy her book created, and the caring eyes of a mother who sees all people as her children.
All right, I'm going to let Lee take us out. She's got the last word. Thanks for joining me at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. You ever get to Hartford, Connecticut, stop on by and visit. Lee, take us out of here. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ed, for providing these pictures and giving us a tour of the home, and an interesting piece on how influential one person can be. And thanks for being with us today. Bye-bye, everyone.